Hi, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be going over one of my favorite yarns to work with, and that is this plush microfiber or baby blanket yarn. I'm going to be going over some pros and cons, as well as some tips and tricks for working with this yarn. So the first great benefit of working with this yarn is that you can make pretty big pieces fairly quickly. So this turtle takes me between 1 and 2 hours to make, and I find using a normal acrylic or cotton yarn, this size would take me about 3 to 4 hours. So that is a big plus if you are working on a time limit or you want to make a gift really quickly. Another thing I love about this yarn is that it's really soft to work with. So sometimes when working with an acrylic, I find that it starts to chafe a little bit on my fingers after I've been working for a while. But this, it's so soft, it just glides through. So I can actually crochet for hours without a problem. Another great thing is that the toys made with this yarn come out really soft and snuggly. So my kids love the toys made with this because they can really snuggle it, and I find the toys made with the acrylic or cotton yarn, they're really cute, but in terms of Snugglability, they're not quite as good as this. One of the best things about this yarn is that when you sew pieces together, it's basically invisible where you've sewed it together because it's so plush. You can't actually see the stitches that you've done. So with standard cotton or acrylic, I always do invisible joins to sew pieces together. And with this, you don't really have to. I do because I'm used to it. But just a standard stitch to sew them together will be absolutely perfect. So there are a few cons to working with this yarn as well. The first one is that I find undoing pieces, the yarn sometimes doesn't hold up that well. So if you've made this tail, for example, and you want to undo it, you can see it snags a bit, and sometimes you can't even undo it all the way. And then the areas that you have managed to pull through, you can see it's not as full as it was originally. So there's how it looks normally, and the areas that I've undone tend to get these little bald patches because the fibers are actually pulled along the string. So I find I can maybe undo once. If I start to undo a second time, the yarn just deteriorates pretty quickly. So that is something to be aware of. Another con with this yarn is that if you're just starting out with Amigurumi, it probably isn't the best one to use, at least not until you've gotten used to what the stitches look like. Because as you can see, you can't really see the V's from the stitches that clearly. So you just have to work carefully at first. Something else to be aware of is that this plush yarn is more expensive than your general acrylic. At least it is in my experience. So if you're just starting out with amigurumi, it's probably better to start with a cheaper yarn, like a basic acrylic, at least until you're comfortable with the stitches and the ins and outs of amigurumi. So I do have a few tips for working with this yarn. Firstly is one that I always do, and that is to use stitch markers. Stitch markers will be your best friend with this yarn. I like to do them at the end of each round. Some people like to do it at the beginning. That's completely up to you. The next tip, and this one is actually super important, and that is the hook size. So I'm going to show you on this jumbo yarn the difference between these hook sizes. This is a 6.5 millimeter or K, and this one is a 9 millimeter, 8 millimeter. And I'm going to show you the difference between these. So this is just a 2-round magic ring with the 6.5 millimeter, and the exact same thing with the 8 millimeter. Now, with the 6.5 millimeter, you can see it's formed this kind of cone shape, and with the 8 millimeter, it's pretty much flat. So when I get a new plush yarn, first thing I like to do is figure out which hook size is right for the yarn. Because if you take a pattern and you start with a hook that's too small, your pieces are going to be too elongated and their heads will have these kind of cone shapes. So that's something I always do with a new yarn. Now, if you don't want to use a bigger hook because you don't want bigger gaps between the stitches, maybe because you're going to fill it quite firmly with stuffing, so these stitches, holes between the stitches are a lot smaller, then what you'll need to do is increase the number of stitches per round. So the standard magic ring has 6 stitches in the first round and then 12 in the second, and increases by 6 each time. If you want to use a smaller hook size, you will need to use more stitches per round. So start with 8 stitches maybe, then go to 16, and then 24, or even 9, maybe even 10 stitches, depending on the thickness of the yarn and the hook size. This will be tricky if you're working off a pattern, because you will need to adjust every single round. The other option is to work off a pattern that already has increased number of stitches per round. These legs have 7 stitches per round. So next is patterns. So with this yarn, I find that it works best with these more simple patterns because it doesn't have a lot of structure to it, or at least not as much structure as cotton or your standard acrylic. So it works really well for these simpler patterns. Something a little bit more intricate like this, that needs a bit more structure, probably not the best one to use. It could probably work, but you might not get the results you want. Lastly, if you are wondering if you should try it out, my opinion is definitely yes. There are a lot of benefits to using this yarn, and it's super fun to work with. I've listed some examples in the description box of different brands, so please check it out if you want to get started with this. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up.